All right, we are live. Dean, how you doing today?
Doing well. How are you?
Yeah, great. Thank you, man. I'm excited to be back doing part 2 of the Music and Criminal Justice Reform panel discussion.
Yep.
Um, a few weeks ago, the first time we did this, I remember sort of being a fly on the wall as you and your guests discussed the Last Prisoner Project and the origins of it. And I remember being taken aback, particularly when you guys started talking about, the original legislation around controlled substances and how there is, more or less a direct link back to segregation and efforts to minimize the efforts to divide people. And in my mind, it really conjured thoughts of how it plays into the greater conversation that we're having as a general public right now about inequality and injustice. So I just want to thank you for facilitating these conversations, for bringing your guests to kind of help our audiences understand what's going on and how they can get involved. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what we're going to be getting into today.
Thanks to the Rootfire family for the opportunity. I'm definitely new to all of this, and I come from a music background, managing bands, and more recently learned about the criminal justice system in America and the world, and very passionate about it, and really wanted to make some changes. And the story of kind of how I got into it is going to happen today. We have Steve here, and definitely one of my mentors in the movement. And if we can just inspire one person who's watching on the the Rootfire platforms, then that's kind of, that's a success in my opinion. And whether there, however many people are watching or how many people become active and passionate about it. A lot of this was, I realized, and we'll kind of talk about Mickey today, is I realized that there's a lot that I don't know, and a lot of people who I want to talk to and conversations that I want to have. And now that we can't have them in person, I want to have them virtually. And I was like, you know what, Reed, you reached out and invited me to do a masterclass on artist management, but I realized that, we had a lot of you guys had a lot of experts doing it. Dan Sheehan and Thomas and Igor and Brian and you have King later today. But so I wanted to kind of change it up and speak about this, but I figured I would just broadcast live the same conversations with experts, and maybe other people can watch it and they can get inspired, and they can kind of, get involved in the movement. So that's what I wanted to do with these, is almost as like, well, I don't really know, too much about Mickey. We're kind of new to each other's lives. So I figured, why not just have our chat and show the whole world what the hell it is we're talking about, and ask the questions that I want to ask. And I'm hoping that other people are, curious about those questions too. So that was kind of the idea behind the whole thing. And so I figured, the Rootfire American reggae community is I know they're very passionate about these issues, but I feel like a lot of people don't know where to start or where to begin or how to get involved or what any of this means. So this was something that I just wanted to try, and I appreciate you guys giving the platform and posting about it, and just get the word out there and see what happens, see who we can talk to. And, there is a huge crossover of the cultures and in the communities that we're talking about. And I figured let's chat and see what happens.
Yeah, you're touching on something that just popped into my head yesterday for the millionth time, which is, every once in a while you'll be having a phone conversation with somebody and think, man, I wish somebody else could hear this, because this is like blowing my mind. So your willingness to be vulnerable and have those conversations and let us into the work that you're doing is really awesome. So I appreciate it. So, I guess without further ado, I will exit the stage and let you kind of take it over here and introduce Mickey and Steve and get into it.
That sounds great.
right.
Let me get them on right now. Okay. Hello.
Hello.
Hey, what's up?
Hey, can everybody read? It sounds good. Video's good. Okay.
Hi to both of you.
Welcome. Mickey and Steve from Lost Prisoner Project and all the other things that you're all doing. I appreciate you coming on this platform. I am new to all of this. This is my second video chat, so thanks for not saying, "What the hell are you doing again?" and just saying yes. So I appreciate that. I know that we have some cool stuff to talk about, and like I said, I think you guys are watching the intro. That the goal here is to communicate with and try to activate some of the American roots, American reggae community who I know are very passionate about cannabis and cannabis justice reform and criminal justice reform. And I figured if Rootfire is wanting to have us have a chat, then great. And I know that Steve, you and I talk often, and Mickey, you and I have, I think, maybe had one video chat before, but I'm dying to know a lot more about you and how you came into the Lost Prisoner Project nonprofit. And so maybe we can start there. Maybe you can tell me a little bit about, where you're from. You just mentioned you're from Texas, but what brought you into this movement? And I know that you have an incredible education, and you're very, very educated and informed and serious. And I'm dying to know, what was it that made you get inspired to change the world and make a better place, and for this, kind of specific area. And then after that, I'm going to jump to you, Steve, and we could talk for hours and hours, and we do, but I'd love to hear your side of the story that I tell how we met, which maybe I'll tell my quick version, and then you can tell your side, and then we go from there. So Mickey, what's your story? Where are you from? Why do you do this?
Yeah. And also, just to your last comment, hopefully not too serious. It's like the work is very serious, but I feel like in order to do serious work, you have to be able to be like not so serious in every other aspect of your life.
I'm the biggest goon of them all. And
yeah, you have to be to keep it pushing.
For sure.
But yeah, so like I mentioned at the beginning, I grew up in Texas, Arlington, Texas. But I like to mention by way of Ethiopia and Eritrea. So my family, community, parents all immigrated here in the 80s due to a revolution happening back home. And so I grew up very much in a grassroots made diaspora in the middle of kind of suburbia Texas. And so it was an interesting Texas experience in that way. My journey to this particular intersection of reform was a bit windy. The short version of the story is in college, I went to Texas A&M University, which at the time was the least LGBTQ friendly public institution in the country. So naturally, as a queer person in a very hostile environment, I got into advocacy work to just really self-protection. So through that, as I was getting my education and then also finding my activist voice, I was thinking about my career and realized that social justice is what I wanted to do. I didn't know exactly what, but I realized that law school was probably going to be the thing that was going to give me the tools to be able to have the impact I wanted. Once I got to law school, I very much realized that criminal justice reform was sort of the way for me to have impact in all the ways that I wanted to, since it's very much the way I saw it sat at the center of all systems of oppression and all sort of continued perpetuated forms of marginalization against the communities that I was a part of. And then, long story short, started off doing street and gang violence work, got very close to proximate to the issues that I felt drawn to, as Brian Stevenson would talk about. But I kept, as much as I learned about what the problems were, what the impacted communities wanted, and even providing them what they needed, there were still these systemic barriers we kept coming up against. I like to point out, for example, I would have guys that I worked with, got them from a point of, came up in the streets, $10,000 less income households, got them up to where they were not off probation parole. That's a major issue, but they were basically out of the streets, right? They're doing everything right. They got a good job. They've got 90K income, and still they're haunted by their incarceration, by their criminal record, etc. So that led me to try and figure out what systemic solutions look like what does it actually look like to move these barriers. So I went and did research at the Bureau Institute of Justice, kind of got inside the belly of the beast, working inside the criminal legal systems to try and figure out what does it look like to decarcerate in jurisdictions at the state and local level. Got a lot of intel, as I would like to say. Like, I really learned what the inner workings look like and just how big of a problem it is, how big of a mess we have to clean up. And decided to come back out to the nonprofit world, focusing on community-led solutions as opposed to strictly system solutions. And that's where I found LPP. Now, the backstory is LPP wasn't brand new to me because Sarah Gersten was one of my closest friends in law school. So we actually organized. Yeah, so we actually organized together while we were in law school. So we were friends, we were comrades, we were colleagues. And even after, we both had sort of big visions of impact and, creating change in the world after law school. So naturally you stay in touch, right? So I went kind of the not traditional, but the very criminal justice focused route. And then Sarah was going off to try and figure out how to, she always had this vision of what cannabis reform really meant, right? What legalization really meant. Sarah was hip to this way before I was, and I think before a lot of people were, but she saw the vision for how cannabis reform was really a critical tool to criminal justice reform. And so as I was doing my criminal justice work, doing street gang violence work, policy research, etc., Sarah was building up this expertise in cannabis reform. And we kept having conversations. And what I kept telling her is, it's amazing in all of these jurisdictions, although we're not talking about cannabis laws or cannabis reform, the thing that continues to pull people into the system is cannabis. But nobody's talking, but it's just completely just ignored piece of the narrative. And it makes sense if you look at how war on drugs is what got us here, clearly undoing all of those policies, practices, and social norms in terms of law enforcement and how the government uses the legal system. Addressing cannabis reform and addressing full legalization would be a critical step towards freedom for Black and brown people. And this is sort of an understanding that I came to through this sort of collaborative learning with Sarah. And thus, once I left the research world and wanted to get back into more direct advocacy work, it seemed like the LPP was really making big strides in, filling this gap in the world, recognizing that cannabis reform and criminal justice reform are the same. They're not separate. And LPP is the only organization that I saw really seeing this vision. So I was honored whenever I got the opportunity to come on as Director of Criminal Justice Law and Policy and try and leverage the expertise I've built up in the criminal justice world and try and utilize that expertise to bring LPP into the fold and get everybody on the same page, cannabis reform advocates and criminal justice advocates, to recognize that we all are in the same fight and we need to be leveraging our networks, our expertise, our strengths, our communities to block in the same direction. And now I'm here.
That's great. We're honored to have you in our lives and to learn from you. And so first of all, thanks for coming on this program, I guess you could say. But also thanks for joining LPP and working with us, and I'm really excited to do some serious work together. So I'm going to tell this story because it's always, I get asked a fair amount from friends and family and friends of friends, how do I get into the music business? Or how do I get into, the entertainment business? And there is no real way, but I do want to tell the story of how I met Steve, because I say the same answer all the time is, don't be afraid to just walk up to people you admire. Don't be afraid to just blind email people, blind call people. Another one of my mentors in criminal justice reform is Jason Flom. And he's on the board of the Innocence Project, founding board member, and he's just a monster in the movement. But same reason, I just sent him a blind text message, and he responded immediately. And that same day, we got an innocent man out of Rikers jail. The first day that I met him, and that's another crazy story. It was Eric for Rebelution was doing an acoustic show in New York, and we were donating the money to the Innocence Project, and I went on stage and introduced Jason, which I never do, and just because he was like, well, I want to go on stage and tell people where their money's going, but I'm just going to walk up there. So anyway, so I walked up there and told people who Jason was, and Jason came on stage and he told us a story. And we on the way to the dressing room to the backstage, the security guard stopped us and he said, "Hey, my roommate and one of my best friends is in Rikers and he's innocent and he can't pay bail." And he wasn't even in Rikers; he was on the boat, which is an overflow prison from Rikers that's in New York. And so that minute, Jason, who was there because of that random text message led to this, led to that, he called a bondsman, got him out. He called a criminal defense attorney and got him out. And if it wasn't for that chance encounter, that poor guy would probably still be in one of the most filthy, disgusting systems and situations ever. But anyway, so the story, how I first met Steve was obviously I manage a reggae band. I got into the cannabis industry. I was advising brands and consulting some companies on business development and all that kind of stuff, and hadn't really found exactly what it was that I wanted to do, but I knew I wanted to be involved in cannabis because I'm obviously have a lifelong relationship with the plant, and I didn't know much about, I knew there was something wrong about the system and the legalization issues, but I didn't really know what, and I didn't know enough. So I got invited to go speak at the Cannabis Conference in Toronto on a panel about branding. And I was like, you know what, I'm going to get up at 7 a.m. and go to this investment brunch. Steve DeAngelo's doing the keynote for it. And I'm just going to go check it out and see. A friend of mine was putting on a conference and got me a ticket and whatever. So I get up early. I'm still a little groggy, you know. The night before, went out to the pre-party and whatever nonsense. But so I'm standing at the elevator, and the elevator opens, and I get in, and it goes down a couple of floors, and the elevator opens, and Steve walks in. And sorry, there's a siren going on. All good. And so Steve walks in, and I was like, all right, I'm going to talk to this guy. I'm just going to just see what he's about and just chat him. And so we just started chatting, and I told him, you know, I'm excited to see his keynote and how I'm a fan of everything that he's done and appreciative for everything that he's done over his, you know, decades of activism and business in the industry. And we just started talking, and we walked outside, and I had an Uber. So we got in the Uber, and we got to spend another 20 minutes talking from the hotel to the conference. And I told him, you know, about my sister, who is a cancer survivor, as am I. But her, you know, she had to go through chemo and use cannabis, and it really helped her, and all these things. And we just connected. And then I was like, okay, well, I'll probably never see Steve again, but it was great that I got a few minutes with him and, you know, got to kind of experience, you know, the energy and who he is. And that night they threw a party at a castle somewhere and invited all the speakers. So turned up, I go sit down, and I'm at Steve's table. And so we just kept talking, and we exchanged business cards. And he said, listen, if you're ever in Oakland, come and let's hang out. You seem like a decent guy. Let's talk about the world. And so I went up, and we had Burma Superstar in San Francisco, and hung out with him and his brother Andrew. And we started talking about, well, maybe, you know, because my background comes from live events. So maybe there's, you know, a live event cannabis thing we could work on together, or maybe there's a branding thing we could work on together. And Steve was like, let me tell you about this idea that I have. And he told me the concept for Lost Prisoner Project, and told me the stats of 40,000 people behind bars and all these situations. And I was like, never mind any business situation. This is blowing my mind. This is insane. I'll do anything I can to help. And that was kind of how I got involved in Lost Prisoner Project. And so, Steve, maybe you can tell your story of like, who the hell is this random dude chatting me up in the elevator at 7:15 a.m. or something like that. But, you know, a year later we had, you know, kind of co-founded LPP, and, you know, obviously Steve's baby and his brainchild and his idea. And I came on board to help in any way I can. And so that's kind of how that's like the chronological timeline of how we got here was. And the bottom line is like the same, going back to the same thing that I tell people all the time is, don't be afraid to just respectfully walk up to people in person, or blind email or blind text. Don't make it generic. Don't, to whom am I concerned? Don't, you know, make it broad, but make it specific and talk to people. And you would be amazed. Some of the most incredible things that have happened to me, both career-wise and just in life, have come from just having the chutzpah to just blind email someone or walk up to somebody. So, Steve, what's your side of that story? And then maybe you can seg into, like, you know, you have a great story of how you actually like decided that you were really gonna really go for it and launch LPP was during a business meeting, and you got a phone call. So I'd love. I haven't ever actually asked you your side of that story. It could just be the same. I mean, obviously, I'm not the icon, and you're not the schmatter random dude trying to get in the industry. But I'd love to hear your side of our first meeting, and then anything else.
Happy to tell that story. And Mickey, it was great to hear more of your story. And let me echo Dean's welcome. It's really great to have you on board. I look forward to hearing more of your stories. So I think that our meeting, Dean, really comes back to sort of the kind of leader that I am. And I'm not like a lot of leaders who come up with plans and build budgets and recruit teams to execute them and establish milestones and build things. I'm different, right? Every now and then, for whatever reason, I'll get a vision that comes flying into my head. And sometimes those visions happen to resonate with other people. And what I do is I just go around talking about the vision to people and hope that somebody's going to say, hey, well, that's really great. Let me help you do it. And then I find people who can put together budgets, who can recruit teams, who can establish milestones and are really good at the execution part of it. So whenever I'm at some place like Cannabis, I'm always looking for people who have a little bit of a glow to them, a little bit of a sparkle to their eye, a little bit more energy, a little bit of a aura, a little bit of a halo. I'm looking for my angels who can help me wrestle these visions down. And you just presented yourself to me in the elevator, and I could immediately tell that you were a bright bulb and that you had a lot to contribute, and you were interested and you wanted to learn. And my passion in life is teaching people about cannabis, and especially helping people become involved in cannabis reform. And when sparks like that happen in a meeting with people, sometimes you don't at first exactly know where it's going to lead. You take that energy and you treasure it, and you kindle it like a little fire, and you pass it back and forth between each other, and you shine it up. And then at some point it sort of illuminates, and you realize what it is that you're there to do together. And that's how I look at our meeting and our subsequent work together on Last Prisoner Project. And it's really been wonderful. Other than my brother, you were really the first to really believe in the vision and lend your arms and your muscle to making it real. So yeah, it's been wonderful.
I also want to say that there is a chat and questions, and I would love if anybody who's watching, if you have questions for Steve or Mickey, you can type them in, and I can see them here, and I can drop them in, and after some questions that I personally have, selfishly want to take up some time on my own to ask these questions. I'd love to get to some questions, and if there are music or Rebelution or Durand Jones The Indications or live event questions or anything, I'll answer those after Steve and Mickey are here. But Steve, would you mind telling the quick story? I think it adds some great context about when you were in a business meeting and you got a call from a friend, and that whole story.
Happy to tell that story. And just by way of context, I've been a cannabis activist since I was a young teenager. I've also been a cannabis business person since I was a young teenager. That means that most of my career was underground. And I lost a lot of friends to prison. I spent time locked up myself. It's something that's been close to me in my life. So the genesis of LPP was in 2017. This was after California had passed its adult use law in 2016, but before the market had opened up. And I, like a lot of California cannabis executives, found myself in Toronto, Canada, the capital of cannabis capital, looking for money so that we could scale up, so that we could grow to meet this expanded market as we went from medical to all adults in the state. And I found myself one afternoon at the top floor of a very impressive skyscraper in the financial district of Toronto, at a very, very long conference table, at which I was seated with some of the real giants of the Canadian public markets, people who move hundreds of millions of dollars around. And it had been a good day. We'd been looking at business plans. We'd been looking at spreadsheets. We'd been projecting how much cannabis we thought was going to be consumed in California, how much of a share of all of those sales we would be able to take for our own organization. And people were feeling good. It was a nice glow in the room. And my phone started buzzing. Normally, I don't interrupt meetings like that to take a call, but in this case, it was my friend Chuck. And I knew he was calling from a correctional facility in Pennsylvania, where he had been imprisoned for importing 14 pounds of cannabis from California to Pennsylvania, actually conspiracy to import it. There was never an allegation that he actually touched the cannabis himself. And I went out into the hall, I took the call from Chuck, and like every call that you have with a friend or a loved one who's in prison, it's just grim, right? It's really hard to talk to somebody you love and know that they're in the kind of situation that they were in. And on this particular day, it was a cold winter day in Pennsylvania. There was a lot of snow on the ground. And Chuck was just upset because he wasn't there to help shovel his mother's walk. And his mother, in her late 70s, didn't have anybody else to do it. And so when I came back into the room, I was in a kind of somber mood. And I looked around at the happiness in the room. It was really, almost joy was going on in that conference room. And I took a look at the documents on the table and I realized two things. One was that, we were talking about vastly, vastly more cannabis than Chuck was serving time for. I mean, orders of magnitude, we were talking about tons of cannabis, not pounds of cannabis. And I realized in that moment that I had to do something, right? That I couldn't allow my friend Chuck to sit in prison and other people like him, because he's not my only friend in prison, and still be on the outside, participate in building this new industry and creating wealth and sitting down with bankers and other, respectable people from polite society. So I felt that I had an obligation to work to get my friends and to get everybody who's locked up for doing exactly the same thing that I was doing in that conference room, where nobody had any fear of being arrested. So that was one thing I realized, a moral imperative. Right? If I'm going to get up in the morning and I'm going to sell cannabis legally and I'm going to look at myself in the mirror and feel good about myself, then I also have to know that part of that day is going to be spent trying to get people out of prison who are locked up. Exactly the same thing. The other thing I realized was a possibility. I looked at the amount of dollars that were on that table, and then I multiplied it in my head by all the other tables where similar conversations were going on that I knew about. And then I asked myself, geez, if we just got 1 or 2% of all of that money that's going to be coming into the cannabis industry, of all of that prosperity that's going to be generated, we could get this job done. And that's when I conceived of the Last Prisoner Project. And the idea is really simple, to make sure that as we build this industry, this global industry all around the world, that we do not leave our sisters and brothers behind in prison who are there for doing exactly the same thing. And of course, there's a very strong racial justice dynamic to this. I grew up in a civil rights family. I grew up at a time when, obviously not very naively, I believe that racism was a thing of the past, that it was, that we were in the process of burying it in my generation. And so I've always, being in the underground, always been aware of the racial disparity. And so that was, a motivating factor for me. So I looked at all these dollars and I said, geez, we can do it. All I really need to do is be able to give a persuasive pitch to people in the industry and ask them to part with a little bit of money. And I believed that they would do it. I believed that when I went to other people who were fortunate enough to be making money in the industry and explained to them what I wanted to do, that they would be supportive. And in fact, that's proven to be the case. And given Last Prisoner Project the ability to grow substantially over the course of the next year, of the last year, and looking forward to doing more of that in the year to come.
Yeah, we've had an incredible year so far. I mean, incredible in terms of nonprofits just starting and trying to grow. We've had a pretty treacherous year in some other areas, but we can get to that another time. Mickey, my question for you is, as the Director of Criminal Justice Law and Policy at Last Prisoner Project, what kind of things are you working on? What are some of the goals that we're trying to achieve? Is it changing laws? Is it bringing in new laws? Is it, what are some of those specifics? Like, what is the goal here for you at LPP? What are we trying to achieve?
Yeah, no, it's a very big question, because it's multifaceted in terms of what it is we're trying to achieve. Because the reality is, it'd be nice to be able to like change laws and things function, as we want and intend and envision them to. But unfortunately, like the criminal legal system and the results that it's gotten us in terms of becoming now a carceral country, right?
What does that term mean? I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. What does carceral state mean?
So when I say carceral state, basically what I'm saying is that mass incarceration is our biggest social problem now. Like, we spend $80 billion annually on our criminal legal system, on incarcerating people, on something that we know actually doesn't make us safer, doesn't reduce crime, and actually has most likely negative impacts on the most impacted communities, which are Black and brown folks, right? So it's like with this very, very expensive thing that is just making us sicker and worse off as a community in all respects. And yet it's where most of our tax dollars are going. And so that's what I mean when I say carceral state. It's when we spend our biggest social policy is around incarceration and around incarcerating people. So it's like you've got states like California that actually spend more money incarcerating their young people than they do educating them. So therefore, it's like criminal justice policy isn't criminal justice policy anymore. That's actually our social policy. And really, I think we would be better off as a society and as a government, as just a community, if we actually recognize it as such, right? Like, we kind of consider the impacts of criminal justice reform as an add-on to all these other policies, when in reality, what we do with criminal justice reform is what's going to impact and benefit all these other areas, because the criminal legal system has collateral consequences that carry over into education, housing, employment, access to social services, mental health, behavioral health, substance use disorder treatment. Like, all of these things hinge on whether or not you have a criminal record, and 1 in 3 Americans have a criminal record. So it's like, if you really start connecting the dots, it's like, wow, we really should be doing everything in our power to solve this problem. And we should be looking for low-hanging fruit, right? One of those things is jails are filled with people who are legally innocent because they're poor, because we still have something that has been named as unconstitutional, cash bail, functioning, alive and well. That's low-hanging fruit. We know it's unconstitutional. We know it doesn't work. All it does is allow innocent poor people to stay in jail and rich guilty people to get out.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Right?
And I was actually going to ask both of you guys to have a few like keywords that people who are trying to get involved, when they hear something, obviously they can Google it, but if they're just watching, like, so carceral state was one of them. Cash bail. Can you explain that a little bit, and what does that term mean, and what do we need to do to fix something like that?
So the short and dirty version of it, like basically what people need to know is cash bail is you get arrested. Let's say you get booked in the jail, right? You haven't been formally charged with anything, but you're detained because you're suspected of having done something. The magistrate court judge, whoever's holding you, says, all right, if you can pay this amount, we're going to let you go free. And if you can't, you sit, right? Now, bail was originally, like, the original intent of bail, or actually the original intent of pretrial detention, detaining somebody before they've actually had a legal proceeding, is either because they're a flight risk or because they're imminent danger to community. Money has nothing to do with any of those things. Money is this thing that our courts came up with to, like, give people, they were like, oh, let's give people skin in the game. Right. But that's not how our society works, because nobody's on equal footing, right? Some people have a lot of money. A lot of people have no money, right? So what ended up happening is people with no money end up being vulnerable to, if you're arrested, you're basically sitting in a jail cell because there's nobody, you don't have the capital to buy your way out of that bad situation and then go get a lawyer and then make sure all your protections are in fact protected, right? If you have money, you can avoid having to sit in that jail cell. You can go get your attorney. You can go and have all of your rights respected in the way that the law intended. Cash bail is what allows this disparity to continue.
So how would we get rid of something like that? Would it be lobbying to change laws? Would it be public pressure? Would it be like, how do we eradicate something like that?
I mean, public pressure is huge, especially because cash bail is something that local jails, like, so when I was doing research, I actually worked very much at the local level, that's county level. And, you know, initially I was like, isn't the problem with the states and the federal, like the higher up is where all the power is? And when I realized it's like, it's actually not true. Counties, local counties have immense power because they are the gatekeepers to the criminal legal system. You have to be booked through a jail and then go through an entire criminal process before you end up in the Bureau of Prisons system, right? Who controls who gets into the jails are local officials. This is your county sheriff. This is your police chiefs. These are your county judges who are often elected. And these are also the people that just regular average Joe folks have the most access to. So it's literally, there are 3,000 jails across the country, 3,000 plus probably, because every single county has at least one. Like I've done research on counties that had like a jail that held 14 people. Every county has one of these jails, and every community has a say in who should have a say in who's being held in those jails because they're actually paying for that. Every jail bed.
It's tax dollars that are going to pay to keep those people in jail.
And often it's the jail, which is the correctional facility that's holding legally innocent people and often just poor, sick, needy people, often black and brown, is the most expensive part of the public safety budget, most likely, in just about everybody's county. It's the thing that people are paying the most money for to keep them safe that actually isn't keeping them safe and is actually making the worst off of us, worse. Right, because the people that end up in jail, honestly, they become described as treatment of last resort because our criminal legal system has become our Band-Aid for failed public health policy, right? We basically said, this is how we're going to deal with our most vulnerable, our neediest, our homeless. The way we're going to deal with them is with the criminal legal system. We're just going to lock them up because we can't deal with them. We can't handle them. And therefore, people just continue to cycle in and out. And eventually people get pushed further and further into the system. And that's how you end up having people that were originally brought in for rolling papers end up sitting in a prison for years. And it's like when you really follow the tracing as to how did you end up here, it's because society failed them from the get-go. And honestly, you can do all of this. You can address all this at your local jail. That's one area that everybody can learn more about and figure out how they can like have a say in who they are, who you are paying to have sit in your local correctional facility.
Got it. Well, I just extended this chat from 1 hour to 6 hours just so we can hear both of you guys continue to talk. So thanks for that. It's really disheartening. And, it feels like as more of these start to happen, more people are becoming educated to the issues, more people are protesting it. It's not just lawmakers and policymakers behind closed doors making these rules that we'll never find out about because that's kind of how we got here. And they obviously, they don't want the public to know and don't want us to know how these systems work so they can just continue on marginalizing and incarcerating people. So, Steve, I have a question for you, and you've literally written the book on this, but how did we get here? How did, the short story, because a lot of people love cannabis. It helps them in so many ways, but they don't really know how it got here. Like most people either now they can, if they're in a legal state, they can just go buy it from a store. But before, how did cannabis get to America? Where did cannabis come from? And it's just, when you're in high school is when most people start consuming cannabis. They just buy it from a guy in the high school, but like they don't know how it got here or how it got into our culture. So kind of two-part is how did it get here and how did we get here in terms of Harry Anslinger and propaganda and all of that kind of changing public consciousness that cannabis is bad as opposed to good. So your book really details, and I highly recommend anybody go pick up the Cannabis Manifesto, because I learned so much reading that I didn't know, because I smoke weed all the time and I consume cannabis in multiple forms all the time, but I had no idea how this thing in my hand and then in my body made its way to me. And those, as you start kind of going back both culturally and physically, how it got here, can you mind just telling us the quick story of where cannabis came from and how it got to America and into our consciousness and into our system?
Well, it's not a quick story. I'll tell it as rapidly as I can.
That's true.
But I mean, it starts when human beings left Africa and started migrating into Central Asia, which was the origin place where cannabis was first grown, first emerged on the planet. And we human beings, until very recently, almost every society that encountered cannabis saw a lot of value in it. And so cannabis was dispersed around the world through a variety of different channels. Now, India, of course, is a nation of brown people. And one of the major channels that cannabis moved through, and this is new to me, it's not in my book, this is new information coming out of an amazing book. I just interviewed the author, Chris Duvall, today, called The African Roots of Marijuana. So from India, one of the ways that cannabis moved was it went across existing trade routes from the coast of India to the coast of Africa. And it landed on the islands of Madagascar and around Mozambique. And then it moved across Africa. It moved up the Zambezi River and moved across Africa, again, in trade routes. People were trading various different things. Well, in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s in Africa, one of the things that was being trafficked in, traded in, was human beings, the slave trade. And cannabis was actually carried across the African continent in large part by people who were either enslaved or who were slavers transporting slaves, because it was such a good all-around medicine. One of the many reasons that it was used. So then cannabis jumps from Africa to the Americas. And this first happens from Angola to Brazil. And in other words, from the hands of Black people to the hands of brown people. It also goes through the island of Jamaica. And when we talk about North America, cannabis came to North America from a variety of different directions. But the two most important ones are that it came through the hands of Black and brown people. One of the vectors for cannabis to come to North America was through the hands of Mexican refugees who crossed the southwestern border in massive numbers when they were fleeing the Mexican Revolution that happened in 1910. So they brought their cannabis with them because, like, marginalized poor people have throughout history, they used it as an all-purpose medicine. They were fleeing war. And when they got across the border, they were not any more welcome in many places than brown people are being welcomed coming across the border now. And under the Trump administration, there are lots of people who are looking for ways to push them back or control them. And you see the first laws about cannabis in the United States being passed just after the Mexican Revolution. And if you go back and look at the legislative history of those laws, and I have, it was all about the people who were using them. We've got these Mexicans, they get crazy, they smoke a little of this stuff, you can't tell what they're going to do. It was all about the people who are using the plant, not the properties of the plant. The other vector for cannabis to come into the United States, into North America, was through Afro-Caribbean sailors from places like Jamaica and Trinidad. And cannabis first came to those places from Africa with the slave trade. And then later on, the British Empire brought indentured Indians from East India to those islands. And they also brought a tradition, a very, very long tradition, the almost original tradition of cannabis with them. So in around the same time that you saw brown people bringing cannabis across the southwestern border, you saw Afro-Caribbean sailors, black people, bringing cannabis into ports like New York and New Orleans. And there they hung out in the kind of places that sailors hang out, right? They were in bars, they were in casinos, they were in brothels, and they were in jazz clubs. Well, jazz and cannabis are sort of natural friends. In fact, it's kind of hard to imagine one without the other. And in New Orleans, at the very, very birth of American jazz musicians, mostly African American, had a love affair with cannabis and found that it did wonderful things to their creativity, and that it got them away from drinking and other more harmful substances. And so from there, cannabis moved up the Mississippi River on the showboats. There were these stern wheel steamboats that used to go up the Mississippi River. They would carry shows and musicians, and they would stop alongside the banks of the Mississippi River in little towns that were too small to even have a theater. And that's where, in those little towns along the Mississippi River, and then finally up in the jazz clubs of Chicago, the cannabis started moving from the hands of black people, from the black demi-monde, into the hands of the white mainstream of America, or what then was the white mainstream America. Mainstream America is no longer white, but it was then. So that's
Thanks for that. Yeah, that's, fascinating. I think, seeing some comments, a lot of people did not know that and are educated to it. And I think that's one of the things that hopefully, you as guests here on this brand new episode series will continue to enlighten all of us. And so we are at 46 minutes. I promised you I wouldn't keep you too long. I personally am happy to keep going. If you have to jump off, you're very welcome to, and appreciate your guys' participation. So I'm going to ask a couple more questions, if that's okay. Just give me I gotta go if you have to go. So not that everyone can see you, because only I can see that. But Mickey, this question's for you. Where is this all going? I know that there has been since George Floyd's murder, thankfully we are becoming more aware of the white supremacy and systemic racism in the United States. And I think because of that, thankfully, a lot more people are putting their passions and finding places for their passions to change all of that. My question is, where are we now? How is it going as opposed to history? And what is this going to look like, do you think, in 3, 5, 10 years? Are some things going to be able to change pretty quickly? I know I told you it would be easy questions, but I just thought of this one might be a bit of a doozy. But where do you see, where is this going? Like, how quickly can some of this stuff change? Can we make quick change? Or some of it's going to be, more of a slow turning ship? What's your opinion on that?
So first off, I'm gonna apologize if there's like loud music that possibly happens in the background. I am in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, so it's like there's a lot of cars driving by that they're having a party outside.
Oh, good. We like music.
Like,
we like music around here.
Yeah, it's good music too, but just like you might not be able to hear me talk. But sorry, they were really having a blast out there. All of that to say though, it's a very lawyer answer. I'm a very much reformed lawyer in that I try and unlearn all the bad things about it and hold on to the things that are useful. But my lawyer answer to your question is that it depends on what kind of changes you're looking for. I will say that I think things haven't changed really that much. I'm gonna be real. Like, in terms of the state of affairs, things, if anything, are worse, to be real, because it's more insidious, it's more ingrained. Things have been reformed over and over again, where it's band-aids to make it look nice when the wound is just getting worse and worse, right, at its core. And so that's what we've inherited, right? So it's a big mess. And honestly, the true healing and true solutions, that's a long game, right? Like, I'm not even focused on that outcome. I don't think we can be too focused on the outcomes, but I am hopeful for us finding progress in the process, right? And changing how we've been doing things, because changing how we've been doing things is what's going to get us to where we want to go in terms of final outcomes. And that's not going to come from laws changing. Like, we should be changing laws, right? But then we also need to talk about accountability, right? What does accountability look like to for our decision makers? What does accountability look like to the private sector, to businesses who have money and capital to spare when you really look at the disparities in terms of how capital is spread around in our country, right? It's talking about what does accountability look like in communities? We all have our privileges and we all have our strengths and we all have our duty, in my view, right? Because we are all impacted by mass incarceration. You're either paying for it with your tax dollars, it's impacting your fellow community members, which is going to impact your collective well-being. Like, this idea of American individualism has got us here, right? Like, and it's a falsehood in that thinking we can do anything or solve anything by ourselves, that as long as I take care of just me and don't think about anybody else, I'll be okay. We can see, I think, in plain view that is just not the case, right? We function as a collective. We hurt and heal as a collective, and it's going to take all of us to recognize our role to change things. So I say I don't have hope in short changes or like any quick outcomes, but I'm incredibly helpful in terms of I have a lot of hope in people right now. Like, I think we're in an interesting moment. I mean, I'm young, right? I'm 29, and people will always say, I'll say, like, I've never experienced something like this in my lifetime, right? And people will be like, oh, well, you're only 29 years old. That being said, like, I try and surround myself with people who have been on this planet a lot longer than me and trying to ask them, like, does this feel different? And I think we're in a moment, right? And when the world is on pause right now, it's like, yes, it's a crisis, and there's a lot of hurt and there's a lot of chaos and uncertainty. But that's also when it's like looking for those bright spots, like when things are terrible or when innovation and opportunity really arises, because it's a time for people to come together, right? When you go through something, and we are going through something on a global scale, it gives everybody an opportunity to pause and kind of, question, how have I been doing things? How have we been doing things? Do we want to keep doing things the way we've been doing things? And I think when everybody is asking themselves that question, that's our time to mobilize and organize, right? That's our time to be raising up this narrative and raising up the narratives of the folks that have been hip this whole time, because they've been living this reality every day. So we should all be figuring out, how can I do my part, right, to create a better future from this moment, right? We're on pause. What can I do to push us in a better direction than we were heading before?
Yeah, that kind of brings me to my next question. Steve, I'm sure you get this question a lot, is people saying, how do I get involved? What can I do? What's the first step? What would you say to people watching, and or just, if anybody approached you on the street? Because I've hung out with you, and people see you and they're, it's like rock star status. It's crazy. Just at restaurants, people walking by, I'm like, I manage bands, and like we eat across the street from the venue sometimes, and they don't get this attention. But we're just out in a random spot in Oakland. And anyway, so what would you say to somebody that's like, okay, I kind of get it now, like either, what can I do? How can I get involved? Whether it's an action or a place to go get education or something like that.
Well, thanks for that little story, Dean. I've, somehow been blessed with an ability to speak in words, things that often are in many people's hearts. And people react to me the way they do, not because of Steve DeAngelo, the individual human being, but because it feels so good to see the words that are in your heart expressed out in the world. And this is particularly true for cannabis people who have had to hide who we are for so long and for so much. So every one of those encounters adds a little bit more juice to my battery to keep on going. My advice to anybody who's looking at doing anything new is to first find out what you're called to. The realm of cannabis reform, the realm of social justice, criminal justice reform is vast. There's a lot of different things that you can choose to focus on, a lot of organizations to work with, a lot of different ways to participate. So the first thing to do is really just listen to your heart. Our hearts are a lot smarter than we give them credit for. And if you take a look at 5 or 6 different possibilities in front of you, your heart will probably lean you towards one of them. And I think that's a good direction to go. And once you know that, then you take a look at your toolbox. What skills do you have? What networks do you have? Who do you know already? Where can you start building? And so I often give this advice to people who are getting into the cannabis industry. But it applies equally well if you're getting into the cannabis reform movement. Because of some of the stories that I just told, have been, really particularly compelled to work on the issue of releasing prisoners. But a related issue that needs a lot of attention is equity in the industry. It's making sure that as we build this new industry, that it's not just a new industry that looks like every other screwed up industry that we're living with today, but that it's a new kind of industry that sets a different kind of pattern, that breaks the mold of what we've been doing, that has diversity, that has a commitment to sustainability, that understands economic justice as being part of the business model. So now today in cannabis, the choices are just endless, right? You can work in the legislative arena. Some people, a lot of lawyers, like to file litigation and move litigation through the courts, landmark litigation that will have an effect. You can be powerful just by getting on the social media feed and pushing out the messages that organizations like LPP push out all the time. So if you love being on social media, that's the world that you want to live in. There's a lot of good work that you can do there. Organizations, range from the Marijuana Policy Project to the Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, which now has a slightly different name, Students for a Sensible Drug Policy, Drug Policy Alliance. There's a number of organizations. So look into your chart, see what calls you, go to the Google search engine, drop in cannabis and 1 or 2 of the keywords that's bouncing around in your heart, and see where it leads you.
That's incredible advice. That's couldn't have imagined it better. That's really great. So a couple more questions. Mickey, what are you reading right now? What either books or you got to go? See you, Steve. Thank you so much. Mickey,
Bye.
do you have to go too, or do you have time for another question?
I can answer that.
Okay,
question,
let's do that one.
All right. Just in terms of what I'm reading, I'm actually teaching a course this fall at Hofstra. So I'm currently reading the books and things that I'm assigning my students. So actually, I'm rereading The New Jim Crow. That's a book that I recommend anybody that wants to learn about criminal justice reform and really have the history lesson that we didn't get in school. I would recommend reading that because it's sort of like the Cannabis Manifesto for just general criminal justice reform, taking you from slavery, black codes through war on drugs, etc., into contemporary sort of mass incarceration. And I'm also reading Queer Injustice because the course I'm teaching is mass incarceration in LGBTQ communities, which is just a whole other issue that kind of I tend to work on issues that just don't get their due time. Like I mentioned, cannabis reform has been treated as separate from criminal justice reform when they're truly one and the same. Same with LGBTQ rights work. The reform movement has acted as though Black and brown people who are incarcerated, who are impacted by mass incarceration, aren't also part of the LGBTQ rights movement, right? So it's like if you talk about what's really important for the most marginalized folks in queer communities, it's criminal justice reform. So that's most of my reading right now.
Thank you. And I'll ask because I know people, including myself, are always there's so much literature out there. There's so much content and podcasts and TV shows and documentaries and all these things. So I think I'm always curious and always look up what the experts are reading to kind of filter that out. So
yeah,
appreciate it.
Sure.
Thanks, Mickey.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Now you want to stay. That's cool.
Well, no, I was gonna say if you're looking for news, what the experts go to for reading, because if that's what you're asking, because that's just what I'm reading right now because of life. But the Marshall Project is the best place to go if you want to get news on criminal justice reform stuff, because they pool all the best sources and all the best news articles out there day to day. And then I would follow the Vera Institute. That's where I used to do research at, and they do another really great job of just sourcing data in a way that's digestible. and they do writing for the general public to understand these big complex issues. So
got it. Cool.
Yep.
Thank you so much. I need to set up another just chat with you so I can pick your brain a little bit more.
All right. So I'm looking forward to it. I'll talk to you later.
Thanks, Mickey. Appreciate it. Cool. I think we're good. Any questions on music, bands, concerts, any of that fun stuff? We'll give it a good 30 seconds. I know I answered a lot last time, so Lizzie B, shout out. Eric Smith, shout out. James, Giant Panda Gorilla Dub Squad. I don't know if you were watching last time, but somebody mentioned Giant Panda Dub last time, and I did mention that you guys are one of my favorite bands. Eric Smith. Okay, cool. Reed, you all good? We good to go here? Should I do the I'm done, I gotta go too?